So when I was thinking about how to respond to today's question, the limits of the human, what is our condition first came to mind before we even get to the condition for contemplation, first of all. But what is the state of what we understand to be the human? And I really appreciate, Tony, you're laying out this important framework for our thinking. And I'd like to contribute to your thinking by talking about some recent events of violence that I feel point us to very certain limits of the human, especially with regards to racism and Islamophobia in particular. The fear of gender non-conforming bodies and also queer forms of sexuality specifically. And also in my own research, I've become very attentive to how non-human animals seem to play a very important role in signaling the intermediary zone between the human and non-human states. So I'd like to speak with you about 3 incidents. The first is that the day after the attacks occurred in Paris, I traveled to visit a cousin of mine who's married to a man who works in the Air Force, and he's down at a NATO command in southern Holland. After I shared with her some sad and also very scared feelings about this massacre, she said, "We should just detonate the entire area," referring to Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Maybe she also meant Gaza, right? Apparently, in her logic, this would also solve the refugee crisis. Of course, there was this Syrian passport found at one of the scenes. And she also thought that it's the problem. The problem is really that these migrants from these regions were really to blame for the violence. And I was so flabbergasted by her outspoken malice towards innocent strangers that I blurted out that this detonation, that's kind of what is happening over there already, and that is the problem. The second event was on November 25th when I attended the 10th commemoration in the Netherlands of the Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is held worldwide to mourn those trans lives lost due to transphobic killings. And what we do is we read the names and also lay roses for them at the site in the Netherlands of the monument for all homosexual and transgender people whose lives were lost in World War II and since then. Now this year, there were 11 trans persons who were reported murdered in Europe, but many more of those murders go unnoticed due to the intertwining of transphobia with hate against women, against sex workers, against migrants, against people of color. And in the last 12 months, the reported deaths of murdered trans and gender variant persons worldwide totaled 271. It's almost one a day. In Brazil, Mexico, and the US, we have the largest numbers, but they also have very strong transgender movements, so that means the reporting is actually better. And many of these people are dying at the hands of intimates, people that are known to them. Many of them also experience sexual assault, and their bodies are often further mutilated or burned in acts known as overkilling. The third event was just yesterday, as I was traveling here, when many Americans in the United States and around the world celebrate what they call Thanksgiving. For many, the holiday represents a day together with family, sharing a traditional meal, and perhaps even giving thanks to our immigrant forefathers who first came to the United States to create the bounty of the life that we Americans now enjoy. All of our cars and our food and our saturated fats. However, the mythology of these kind Amerindians giving food to the pilgrims as a part of their harvest celebrations, or the other way around, is depicted in this painting where the poor Indians are sitting on the ground and are being given food, very grossly distorts the reality of indigenous peoples murdered by Puritan religious zealots who stole their land, who brought disease, and enslaved them. So during the first Thanksgiving, European colonizers were actually giving thanks about the successful massacre of the Pequot tribe. And it was only in 1863 did President Lincoln declare it a national holiday. And it was only in the 1900s that the myth gained the kind of traction that it does today. So and I want to point out that's also another height of the colonial period. So this holiday continues, I would say, an epistemic erasure of indigenous ways of life, to the point that today the president has to pardon a turkey from being killed, rather than actually address the ongoing slaughter by police and the imprisonment of Native peoples. Now, President Obama, are you familiar with him? Okay, you've heard of the guy, right? He's quite famous for being openly uncomfortable with his duty. He has to actually go and look at a turkey and say, "I pardon you." And of course, it's very comical. But he's the first one who, I think, is actually maybe thinking about how this turkey stands in for all the racialized peoples who were enslaved and imprisoned or otherwise condemned to die. His pardon also confirms his ability to decide as a sovereign, as Foucault tells us, of a settler nation who may be allowed to live and who must die. It is a biopolitical act. Of each ordinary and extraordinary incident, event, or holiday, I ask, what does it tell us about our human condition today? We might also wonder, how can we try to be and stay human in the face of the drama of history? I'm borrowing some language from the program, but I'm wondering here, that history, however personal or however distant, I want to make that amendment. So we might query if these are actual human acts, do we even want to be human? Do you want to be associated with the pardoning of a turkey, right? With the detonation of an entire area just to solve the refugee crisis? Or with the killings of a transgender woman of color because she's different from you? So this session on the limits of the human might be guided by the ethical quandaries that arrive in limit cases. Today, I suggest that we try to determine what systems are controlling the cutting boundary of this limit. Right? Every limit suggests that there has to be a boundary, and I'm curious about the different theorizations of what is the cut. For instance, in the image of Caracas, of the motorway, right? So what is it about transport in particular that the wrong side of the tracks, in my idiom? So in my talk, I want to address these effective forces of hate, of violence, that become systematized into pervasive stigma and discrimination of some who are made to feel inhuman or even entirely non-human. But I think there are also other effective forces at play. Here I refer to Eve Sedgwick, effective forces that are more reparative, that are trying to do better and to stem the tide of negative feelings and introduce humor, adoration, and perhaps some civil compassion. Consider these cat postings from Belgium on November 22nd, made on Twitter in response to the request that during a national emergency, no one tweet information that could be useful to terrorists about the armed operations that were going on in Brussels. So using the hashtag Brussels lockdown, Twitter users post pictures of their pets, but also they've recycled known cat pics that are, has anybody seen these cat pics before? Yes? Okay. So of course we are seeing them in another way when you have this hashtag. This time they're trying to imbue different kinds of feelings about the situation. Of course, we have the one at the spa telling us to relax, chill out. It says, yeah, relax, my friends, Brussels lockdown. Or the other one, it's a bit more to the rescue, a kind of cuteness of the little cat musketeer. Yeah. Some other ones had words of praise, like, way to go, Brussels, this is the way to handle it. And some were just saying, I'm really glad that I can participate, here's my super cat. It was really hard to pick, actually, which ones. Okay, so to show you. Trivial materials, right? Certainly. But I would say they're also very informative as forming limit cases to the human as well, because these were also tweeted. Other users took a decidedly different turn in posting cats that figure them as the terrorist, in as far as they have Muslim or Arab markers attached, and we see one that's even shown to be a jihadi who's wearing a suicide belt. So these cats are able to carry the weight of human figuration. They appear as the perpetrator and the victim, the revenger and the helpful citizen. With this second set of tweeted pictures, I think we're closer to understanding that we have departed from simply humanizing animals, and instead we are animalizing humans. Specifically, those humans who do not fit into a privileged or desirable category and are therefore dehumanized already. Ava Hayward and Jamie Weinstein argue that geopolitical trauma, the first quote, geopolitical trauma is the landscape through which transgender people and animals meet. Both suffer in some sense from being cast from the safeguard of humanity, marked with sexual indifference. I'm thinking of the cat at the spa. Do you see a girl cat or a boy cat? Right? So there's a kind of sexual indifference or ambiguity here. And we can see that the animal and the trans person is often given the same sort of violence of sexual erasure with the indeterminate pronoun it. So in Hayward and Weinstein's 2004 special issue on Tranimacies, Camille Nurka's article, which is called Animal Techne Transing Posthumanism, that may be interesting for you. In it, she explains the radical challenge to the human made by transgender studies. The modern scientific, rational scientific conception of the human that is brought forward in the Enlightenment was no longer divinely ordained with masculine and feminine elements that we know of from Aristotle or from Plato's Symposium. But this new human was still marked by gender. Sex became an empirical fact of bodies. It's already in there. It's not given as a divine essence. So we have inherited this template of the rational scientific conception of sex as a part of humanism's philosophical weight. With it, we retain the idea of a preternatural gender, so that's even prior to nature, in the observable qualities of sexed bodies, such as greater strength in some men's bodies to justify all women's subordinate position. So man's perfectibility involves his evolution from animal man to the state of civil man that is bound then by the social contract. That's the gist of the Enlightenment thinking of autonomy. So the perfect woman, however, is purposed to please the man because her constitutional weakness dictates that she cannot do otherwise. And I would insert here, so much for Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes and this cosmology in which women and other irrational animals are subjected to man's rule according to the law of nature, right, which is also man-made. Humanism is dead. Why are we actually sitting here then? Because for most of us living on this planet, we have never been human. And that is a quote from Donna Haraway. With Tranimacies, a concept I've been working on with the scholars Mariana Zagalinska and Anthony Wagner, sorry, my Polish is terrible, we've been working on this concept for a special journal issue of Angelaki, and Medina will have an article forthcoming with it, yes. And with this concept, we want to account for those intimate links made historically and today still between trans people, women, and non-human animals, all those crazy irrationals, right? And to open up other cosmologies in which critical links are made for liberatory purposes between, and we're trying to bring together trans studies, critical race theory, feminism, queer theory, indigenous studies, and animal studies, which in some combination have talked to each other, but not yet in a special issue. All of them are present. For instance, queer theory often has a problem with race, and trans often has a problem with indigenous studies, so we're trying to create a platform for another kind of conversation. So before I move on to discussing artists that are tackling racism, transphobia, and colonial violence in their paintings, installations, and performance, I want to elaborate on our aims to intervene in today's debates on the human-animal kinships. So we propose to depart from a current deadlock in the discussion about gender, race, ability, class, and between human and non-human animals, which we see as occurring through a framework of continued sameness and difference. So basically we see that the problem resides in this continuing sameness and difference within critical theories in which they use comparative or analogical othering, or its flip side, saming. So you can say race is like gender in this way, and then within that analogy, you lose the specificity of what each is doing. And we see, of course, assemblage theory is very important for addressing this problem, but we also want to offer two other alternative analytical routes. So first, the perspective of trans studies mobilizes a transversal and what's called transing method of uncovering links between fields, as well as offering an understanding of subjectivity as always emergent because of its transitional quality. Second, from within a post-colonial perspective, the critique of inappropriated otherness that's offered by Trinity Minha calls attention to how intersectional power differentials create groups of inappropriate people who then become appropriated by the privileged class. So there's a lot going on within this discursive term of inappropriated otherness. And in English, it sounds a lot, well, it's easier to grasp, but you have people that are inappropriate. It's like, that's not appropriate here. You're outside the limit. And then you also have the appropriation when people take something over. So the marginalization experienced by these groups makes it possible to cluster them together, although some axis of their identity may neutralize another one. So what we want to show, though, is that because of this clustering effect, we need to have these interdisciplinary alliances in order to effectively decolonize these various ethico-political sites that are doing the clustering, right? So we need the better tools, I would say, for the thinking and not the tools that have created the problem in the first place. So Tranimacies is asking us to consider, I think as a term, as a compact term, of trans animal, of intimacy, and also of animacies, is asking us to consider the links between wider struggles for liberation across the spaces that are held open by transgender theory, animal studies, and critical race scholarship. So we relate these fields of study and activism through how they challenge the regulatory forces that abet and maintain what Mel Chin identifies as a hierarchy of animacy. Is anyone familiar with this book, Animacies, Biopolitics? Okay, it's kind of our jumping off point for this special issue, and a book that I have found to be extremely fruitful for my own thinking. And that's because there's a hierarchy of animacy. So I think of it in terms of there's a scale of liveness or the level of movement, or the measure of the spirit or the soul, which you can hear in the term animus or anima that it comes from. So the concept of animacy describes the affective zones and tendencies that map what we understand to be live and dead, and it tries to broaden the field of life beyond the human to non-human materials such as stones, mercury, lead, and even language. Attention to animacy crucially also then displaces a binary of something being life and non-life, and focuses our attention on the politics of order, a politics of those proper intimacies, proper ways of relating. By tracing these moments of taxonomic tensions or the between spaces of interspecies, we seek to interrogate the ways in which these taxonomies of human, animal, plant, and virus become inflected and also redirected by those different categories of race, gender, ability, class, sexuality, and geopolitical location. So our starting point is the insight that the figures of trans and also of animal have long been linked, intimately linked in troubling histories of the human-non-human interface. Specifically, so they're on the cutting edge, basically. They show us where the edge is cutting, specifically shaped by colonialism, capitalism, biotechnology, and particularly regarding transgender issues, the medical scientific industry. We can think of eugenics projects that, for instance, force sterilization that has happened for women of color, but it also happens in many places if you want to change your legal gender marker, you have to undergo a surgery that sterilizes you effectively. So it's also some shared issues that if you look at it from another point of view, you can suddenly see all the connections. So what are the possible, imagined, and visceral moments of intimacy between animal and trans studies today? Artworks in particular forge new links between circulating affects, which glue together bodies, transgender experiences understood broadly, and human animals. They further demonstrate the importance of unwinding the troubling histories of colonial anthropomorphism, largely founded on these dehumanizing taxonomies, bio-capitalist processes, and identity-building practices that are targeting gender and sexuality. So we learned from Foucault that in order to have your subjecthood, you have to be able to speak of what sexuality you are. That's the way to attaining a foundational subjectivity. So the politics of order are about a cut between human, animal, and machine, the cut between male, female, and other, the cuts between animated, alive, and dead. And from within this purview, Tranimacies, I say, present promising monsters, again to borrow from Haraway. Our hope is to reanimate these promising monsters in indigenous, non-Western, and also trans-species context, in order to make solid challenges to colonializing discourses. So why another term, right? Do we really need, after we've had Tranimacies, do we really need Tranimacies? And there's a certain risk, I would also say, in pushing together transness with animality, because it's like already so over-determined that trans people are seen as a kind of animal because they're desexed or non-sexed or ambiguously sexed. And I would say we're not looking for a kind of perfect merger of the two analytical categories, but rather an unruly or a wily or feral, awkward, perverse relationship that will generate new meanings instead of collapsing back into the same old, same old. We want to speak through, I would say, the silences as well in post-humanist thought, which often wants to do away with this kind of problem of these specific identity categories, as if we're all past that now that we can grow another ear. And we want to point to also different geopolitical and theoretical frameworks. So following Trinity Minha's ethical suggestion to not speak about, but just speak nearby, I want to engender the intimate proximities of Tranimacies by showing artworks that occur in a context near to my own and to where we are today. So I hope that in speaking of what is nearby, I can bring to bear new links between these different frameworks. Because regimes of sexuality are a core enforcer of these intimate links, I believe that art especially helps us to take into consideration the aesthetic impact of multi-species societal structures and activism. The artworks I will discuss with you today very often include the artist's own bodies to highlight their visual exclusion from the category of the human. And I would do this in any context, but also today I want to say if for whatever reason you don't want to see naked bodies or scenes of non-heterosexual intimacy, please feel free to leave. And of course, you can always close your eyes. So I just want to give you that agency. So now the first image. I don't know how we are doing for the light. Is it okay? Okay. This is by Kent Monkman, who is a Canadian artist of mixed Anglo-Irish and Cree ancestry. He's a member of the Fish River Band in North Manitoba, who works with a variety of mediums, including painting, film, video, performance, and installation. And I'm wondering if anyone is familiar with Kent Monkman's work. Okay. Since the 90s, he's exhibited widely in Canada and also internationally, including the show Remember Humanity at the Witte de Wit in Rotterdam. And this recent painting, The Massacre of the Innocents, I would say is typical of the lush panoramic style that Monkman often uses to reference the Hudson Valley School. The Hudson Valley School, I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but it's a North American group of painters who were basically sent out to show what the New World looked like, and they produced very romanticized landscapes depicting the Indian man as a stoic, primitive, dark other. And they also often use these tiny little figures in this enormous landscape. So these paintings mythologized the dying red man and his savage kin at the hands of heroic colonial adventurers. And here the imagery, I would also say, is not just a landscape, but it's also a historical battle scene, like many other that were painted in kind of documentary style to capture who the winner and the loser were. So much like the turkey figures as the pardoned Indian in the presidential ceremony, here I see that the beaver are figured as native warriors fighting the colonizers amongst the resources of the felled trees. And it's set a bit strangely, right? Beavers, what are they doing high on a hill far away from their dammed rivers? And if you look closely, some of those beavers seem to be winning, right? So they're all kind of caught in the midst of a grapple. There's a struggle going on. And what I find really interesting here is it's not clear which way it's going to go. Where's the big horse, right, with the commander who's leading the way? So it's not that this is a particular battle, but it's the massacre of the innocents. And we have to wonder here, who is innocent, right? Where do we attribute guilt is the follow-up question. So history is painted by the victors is another one from 2 years ago, and we find, I think, a very sly art historical commentary with this title. It's yet another Monkman strategy of painting revisionist history. So you might imagine that these au naturel bathers are the very same colonialist adventurers relaxing after doing their battle. From the beginning, Monkman appears in his paintings in this persona of Miss Chief Eagle Testicle. I wish actually I had written that down, but it's Miss, M-I-S-S, Chief, and of course you can hear there, mischief in English, and Eagle Testicle. Eagle is spelled as the bird, and testicle spelled a little bit differently. The the technical term for male genitalia. And if you say it quickly, egotistical, we get egotistical. So there's quite a bit of punning going on here. Now, Monkman has talked at length about mischief, if you'd like to read more about it, but what you can get from it already is that there's a reference to ego-centered Western societies, to fake Indian names, and also to the history of and tradition of drag queen personas having very outrageous names. So how is Monkman embodying mischief here? In wearing red, which is an important color in North American indigenous cosmology. And she is standing here nude in thigh-high boots, much like Cher is in her various Indian dress. Now, recently in Toronto, I was able to view this grand installation at the Gardner Ceramics Museum called The Rise and Fall of Civilization. And it's set up like a diorama of a life-size buffalo jump. In the 1800s, according to the Enlightenment ideology of progress and colonial doctrine of manifest destiny, white settlers pushed west, where they encountered a herd of some 50 to 7 million buffalo who ranged from central Saskatchewan and Alberta down to Mexico. So two things stood in the way of laying those railroad lines and colonizing the Great Plains: the buffalo and the native people whose territory and way of life centered around them. The genocide of the buffalo was central to the genocide of the native peoples. They were conflated. Both were considered brutes who stood in the path of progress and civilization. So the extermination involved running buffalo off high cliffs, which was very efficient, because if you shot them, they had such strong family ties that they would stop and mourn their dead. The bones at the base of the buffalo jump were used to manufacture bone china, then extremely popular in England. The hides were sold, but the meat was left to rot, which also caused mass starvation of native peoples. The cavalry was instructed to kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone. So the animalization of the people, whose own cosmology says that the first people were buffalo people, is here turned back on them in a dehumanizing gesture. And settler colonization requires the simultaneous exploitation and erasure of animal and indigenous bodies. I'm borrowing here from the theorist Billy Ray Belcourt. So let's look a little closer, because this is the first thing that I saw walking into the installation, and that is the mannequin who is resembling Kent Monkman dressed as Mischief, standing stoically at the precipice, gesturing outward towards the edge, but also to the pile of broken ceramic shards. Let's see. The shards are collected on the floor there. We see in the shards the broken bones of civilizations, both indigenous and settler alike. In an interview, Monkman explains that Mischief is two-spirit, referring to someone who feels the spirits of masculinity and femininity. This idea of sexuality as sometimes being fluid was an accepted element of indigenous society that the Europeans repressed. I'm speaking in Monkman's words. It didn't fit their norm. The notion of a third gender was something Europeans didn't understand. Mischief is a part of a larger notion of the sacred, that everything is valued, and this, among many other traditions, were outlawed or cut out of indigenous life. Like the buffalo who were near extinction in the late 1800s, two-spirit people and the native way of life was on the brink of abyss. The installation asks us to think about the role of two-spirit persons alongside the buffalo in trying to save indigenous cultures. How am I doing on time? Should I finish? 5:10? Okay. 5:07. So this is also a contemporary artist, Raven Davis, who identifies as two-spirit and Anishinaabe Aboriginal, and they are from the Ojibwe Nation in Manitoba. I'll just say that Raven learned traditional painting from their mother, a style here that you can see depicted in an image of a native woman who's among the fish who are feeding from her breast. I find it a very erotic image. And perhaps, though, to the settler colonialist mind, it might be a very confusing interspecies intimacy in which milk is being fed as life-giving water to the salmon. But from a nativist from an indigenous worldview, there is no division of the species, or what we call a speciest thinking, that would implant humans hierarchically above non-human animals. And instead, I would say what we're looking at is an interdependent model of animality envisioned according to indigenous cosmology. And when I was interviewing Raven a couple weeks ago, they were telling me also about how for them artwork is an insurgency, because very often you hear Western thinking or Western ways of light, and Raven's like, but I'm in the West. I'm here. I'm in the territory of Ontario. This is for me an erasure if you say that the West is and the rest. So I just wanted to bring that up because of something that I also learned from them. So here, instead of seeing that there's even a division of the human and the animal and interspecies mixing, there's actually a painting over a human figure of an animal. And in this next one, Raven is standing with two photographs titled "A Severe Loss of Native Land" and "A Severe Loss of Clean Water." And their lover is depicted in both images, and they have a ceremony in which the painting took place, and then afterwards also used the traditional painting method to paint directly onto the photograph. So I find it also a beautiful merging of contemporary and traditional craft. What it's doing as well is saying animal activism is something that a lot of, I would say, Western environmentalists are trying to do, where they bestow citizenship or rights upon animals, trying to bring them up to human standards. But I would say an indigenous orientation to decolonial thought, as Davis' works suggest, directs us towards our shared animality and futurity, because here the devastation of water and land is fused in one. Juliana Huxtable is also North American. For her, history and sci-fi futurity are at the center of her work. She was born in Texas, assigned male with an intersex condition, and Juliana's body and also her self-awareness gradually started expressing feminine qualities. This is a very important moment in the New York art world. It's the new museum triennial, and she became, I would say, the star at the center of it. You see her self-portrait on the left, and a sculpture that recalls the sleeping hermaphroditus. Has anyone seen that in the Louvre? Perhaps it's a very famous classical sculpture. This one, however, was made with the new technology of 3D scanning, so it's actually plastic instead of marble. And here we are, I would say, shoved into the bright futurity with the metallic sheen. And also, it's the sleeping hermaphroditus is here awoke. She is awake. She's staring at us. She has a very confident mudra, which is the pose of her hand. But you can still glimpse her breast and penis. But there's no shame here. There's no invitation of voyeurism. You are in this together. In her self-portraits, Huxtable envisions herself as a cyborg cunt, priestess, witch, Nuwaubian princess. And perhaps, like me, you have never heard of the Nuwaubian nation. It's a sect of the Nation of Islam. Maybe Malcolm X, anyone? Nation of Islam. And they believe that black people are the descendants of lizard aliens who created white people. So, it's a cult. Huxtable's not affiliated with the cult, but she's using its ideology to position herself in a futuristic world, energized as a lizard alien royal, far removed from the trauma of her childhood and the daily grind of New York. So these self-imaginings for her are opportunities to create avatars, a constantly growing list of references in her head that allows herself, I would say, to access a kind of imagination to be able to translate herself into a discourse that isn't present before to understand who she is, who her embodiment is. This is a recent performance commissioned by both MoMA and Performa, and it deals much more thoroughly with history. So I wanted to give you both how her work deals with futurity as well as history, and a very much revisionist one. But the last artist, let me first say something about the political condition of trans life or of black life or of indigenous life and all forms of animality, I would say shares something, and that is the thought that it doesn't even exist. So when we talk about extinction, we also have to talk about what, in whose epistemology are they extinct, right? Laverne Cox is an actress on Orange is the New Black and also a very important spokesperson right now. And she writes, "At the heart of the fight for trans justice is a level of stigma so intense and pervasive that trans folks are often told we don't exist. That we're really just the gender we were assigned at birth." So their self-conception is rejected. Now, terrible violence is directed at the non-existing, the never having existence. And I think there's much we can learn from by allying ourselves with the nearly extinct buffalo, beavers, and wild salmon. So regarding the gross violence that surrounds us daily in the news, like the explosions in Paris or Beirut or Nairobi and Madrid, we often lose touch with the reality of that violence. Its constant drip, drip as constructed images on the screens of Hollywood or on our own Facebook stream. And this drip, drip is deconstructed by the Canadian-American artist Castles, who uses the physical body as sculptural mass in order to rupture societal norms. I was just at this performance, Inextinguishable Fire, and two stunt professionals carefully prepared Castle's body in order to be lit afire. This happened on stage at the National Theatre in London. Here you see the stunt person take a burning torch. And I can tell you, seeing someone set on fire in person is really different than watching it in a James Bond film. For 14 seconds, Castle's burnt. And I think in this effigy, you have all sorts of images that come to mind. For me, I think of napalm, gasoline in an act of protest, or acid in an act of honor killings, or the charred remains of a gay, lesbian, or transgender person. Castle's work is deeply connected to the problem of empathy, of trying to connect or even imagine the violence experienced by another, whether that be across cultural divides or spatial. And one that relates to our context here in Russia has been performed this last summer in Kupoko, Finland, which is 210 kilometers away from the border. The site-specific performance addresses the proximity of the anti-festival who commissioned the work to the country where queer and trans lives are acutely vulnerable and under siege, lacking any civil protection under law. So Castle's performance, you can see, took place in a parking garage, completely dark except for the lights of 2 cars. People were invited to sit in the cars, and what they hear is the news clips, music, and talk radio from both sides of the Finnish-Russian border. And what was performed was a choreographed fight scene between Castles and an invisible opponent. I found this still to be particularly moving. It continues Castle's exploration of the radical unrepresentability of certain forms of trauma and violence. It calls into question the roles of witness, victim, and aggressor, questions I think that are important for all forms of animality. Who is accountable for this violent act? You mentioned before the Du Bois quote about, or discussion about being a problem, and I just wanted to come back to that because I'm not sure everyone is familiar. This piece was written 2 years after Du Bois graduated as the first African American from Harvard University, and he writes, "Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. Now to the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word." The works I discuss with you today are about the limit cases of the human for those who problematize the boundaries of humanity, who feel the cut of their exclusion and work to repair and reimagine a world in which the violence they suffer is finally considered the real problem. What counts as violence, I would say, is a highly fraught and political question central to grasping at the outer limits of the human. Thank you very much for being here today. Thank you.
Questions? Well, then I have a question. I was listening very carefully, and I was thinking about many things, and actually you started talking about that, but I wanted to ask you about your attitude to such relatively new opinions, positions as the idea of the end of human supremacy as a species, and even of the essential human self-destructive programming, or the thought that life and nature edit themselves and maybe soon eliminate humans out of their texts. So what is then left for us, the almost post people, in this situation? Of course, I was thinking here about the book by Claire Colebrook that I'm sure you know, Death of the Posthuman is called, and other such recent texts, which claim that what has come to be known as the human, despite its normative intensity, can provide neither foundation nor critical lever in the Anthropocene epoch. So I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on that, if possible. Okay.
Yeah, I have to say I stick with this. We have never been human, and it's over. But that does not mean there isn't an awareness that some people have been able to access that category as an identity and fulfill it. I'm thinking here you could consider whiteness. That doesn't exist either. But nevertheless, white supremacy does. So I would say a certain form of humanism certainly exists. And it, for me, is an ontological as well as an epistemological problem because of the way that it works as a system of exclusion and allows us to only understand or relate to certain forms of knowledges, and others become subjugated. And I guess what I'm trying to do here is to point to artworks that are articulating important subjugated forms of knowledge and teaching us new ways to think and interact with the world. So if there is leverage in the human, it would be, I would say, something to grasp onto to kind of pull it down. And I'm learning a lot from indigenous responses to animal activism as an important way of not trying to get everyone up to this false level of supremacy. It's, for me, much more important to realize that we're all in this together, down here in the mud. So that's a worldview shift that has to be made.
Where would you put the concept of the Muslim?
Of the Muslim?
Yes.
As a migrant or as a...
Well, as an entity from which that which is called human has been removed.
Are you speaking particularly about people who practice Islam, or?
No, I'm talking about. I'm using kind of what Amigan described in relation to the Holocaust, in relation to the concentration camp, of those people who had lost every kind of semiotic indicator of humanness, who have been stripped of every possible form of dignity, who were, in a sense, simply reduced to bare life. So if the human doesn't exist, what is the non-existent?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that what we can identify quite easily as the Holocaust and genocidal behavior, actually you made this point very, very well, that hasn't left us, right? Like the quote from Bauman, and I'm trying to also insert the problem of gender and sexuality as certain ways that bare life is rendered. And I guess if it's going to be reparative in any way, it would be through affect, but not through the identity project. But I'm also exploring right now works by Sylvia Wynter and the praxis of the human, which I'm finding really helpful as a way through.
But there is a crisis of categories, really.
Yeah. 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 I mean, we can't do away with certain categories, but I think pointing to shared histories and also having more of a coalitional politics for me is really important. And that's not just coalitional amongst those lost to humanity, but those who never were.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions?
Do you all think it's totally wild to have an alliance with beavers and wild salmon?
Why not?
Well, not?
We were discussing this yesterday with Lena, actually.
Okay.
Maybe she will mention this. Okay. Okay, thank you then.
Yes, thank you. On the first slide, I had also my email. You're very welcome to speak with me later if you prefer to talk one-on-one.
Yeah, please do that. Thank you.